The moment Alexander Hayes saw the baby, he realized the one thing his money could never control was the truth. But that wasn't the line that would make millions of viewers stop and listen. Had been waiting for both of them long before he ever made the offer. And for a brief second, something unfamiliar crossed his mind, something he quickly dismissed as irrelevant. Because in his world, hesitation was weakness and intuition was unreliable. And yet as Lily finally spoke, quietly accepting the deal with a calmness that should have raised more questions than it answered, the balance of control he believed he held had already begun to shift in ways he couldn't yet see. Because this, long before stepping into it, and when the medical consultations began, when doctors spoke in precise, reassuring tones about health, timelines, and expectations, Lily listened carefully, asking questions that were thoughtful, sometimes unexpectedly specific, enough that one physician later remarked that she seemed unusually prepared for someone in her situation, a comment that reached Alexander and lingered in his thoughts longer than it should have. Meanwhile, Alexander maintained his distance, monitoring everything through reports and updates, preferring structure over presence, because involvement created variables, and variables created risk. But despite that distance, he found himself watching the security footage more often than necessary, noticing small details he could not explain, the way Lily would pause by the window at exactly the same time each evening, the way she would sometimes smile faintly at nothing visible, or the way she never once asked about him directly, as if she already understood him without needing confirmation, and that absence of curiosity was more unsettling than any question could have been, because in Alexander's world, everyone wanted something from him. Everyone tried to get closer, but Lily did not. She simply followed the agreement with a calm precision that mirrored his own, and somewhere beneath his certainty, a quiet question began to form, not loud enough to disrupt his control, but persistent enough to remain, because for the first time in years, Alexander Hayes was no longer entirely sure that he was the only one shaping how this story would unfold. By the third week, the routine had settled into something that looked almost predictable on the surface, but underneath it, subtle shifts were beginning to take shape in ways Alexander Hayes could not easily quantify, and that alone was enough to disturb him, because predictability had always been his strongest advantage. Yet Lily Parker continued to exist just outside of it, following every rule while somehow changing the atmosphere of everything around her, and it became most noticeable during the first official ultrasound appointment, a moment that Alexander had initially decided not to attend, choosing instead to receive the medical report afterward like any other update in his carefully structured system. But on that particular morning, something made him change his mind without fully understanding why. And less than an hour later, he found himself standing in a quiet examination room, watching through a controlled expression as the technician prepared the screen, the soft hum of the equipment filling the silence between them. And for the first time since this arrangement began, Alexander and Lily were in the same space without a table, a contract, or a layer of formality separating them. And yet even then, Lily did not look at him the way people usually did. There was no expectation, no attempt to read his reactions. Just a calm presence that made him feel as though he had stepped into something already in motion. When the image finally appeared on the monitor, small and indistinct to an untrained eye, the technician smiled and began explaining what they were seeing, pointing out early development markers, measurements in inches, steady progress that confirmed everything was proceeding normally. But while the words were reassuring, Alexander found himself focusing not on the data, but on Lily, because instead of watching the screen with amazement or nervousness, she seemed to already know what she would see. Her expression soft, but not surprised, as if this moment was not new to her at all. And then she spoke, quietly, almost absent-mindedly, making a comment about the timing that caused the technician to pause, a small detail about developmental stages that she should not have been certain about without prior experience. And when asked how she knew, Lily simply gave a brief answer, something vague, something easy to dismiss. Yet it lingered in the room longer than it should have, settling into Alexander's thoughts with an unfamiliar weight. After the appointment, as they walked through the hallway, Alexander finally broke his usual pattern and addressed her directly, asking a simple question about how she felt, expecting a simple answer in return, but Lily's response was anything but simple. She said she felt exactly as she expected to feel, and that this was unfolding the way it was always going to. And there was something in the way she said it. Not emotional, not dramatic, just certain. That made Alexander stop for half a second longer than he intended, because certainty was his domain, not hers. And yet in that moment, it felt as though she was operating with a knowledge he did not have access to. And as they stepped into the elevator, standing side by side in silence, Alexander realized something that unsettled him more than any complication could have. This was no longer just about control. Because for the first time, he was beginning to sense that Lily Parker was not simply part of the plan. She might be the reason the plan existed at all. And that possibility introduced a level of uncertainty he had never learned how to manage. As the weeks moved forward, what should have felt routine began to carry a quiet tension that neither Alexander Hayes nor Lily Parker openly acknowledged. Yet it was present in every interaction, in every glance that lasted half a second too long, in every silence that seemed to hold more meaning than words ever could. And for Alexander, this tension translated into something deeply unfamiliar. A sense that control was no longer absolute, that despite the structure he had built, there were the windows, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, until Alexander finally addressed what had been building beneath the surface, asking her directly why she seemed so certain about everything, why she acted as though none of this was unexpected. And Lily did not hesitate. She did not deflect or soften her response. Instead, she looked at him with a steady gaze and said that some paths do not feel new when you have already imagined them enough times. And while the words were simple, their implication lingered heavily in the air between them, because it suggested a level of awareness that went beyond coincidence, beyond adaptation, something closer to intention. Alexander tried to rationalize it, to frame it as intuition, resilience, or even luck, but none of those explanations fully settled the unease forming in his mind, because deep down he understood patterns, he understood behavior, and Lily Parker did not fit into any pattern he had ever studied or controlled. And as he prepared to leave that night, he found himself doing something he had not done since this arrangement began. He gave a direct instruction to increase observation, not because he believed something was wrong, but because for the first time, he was no longer certain that he was the one observing, and that realization marked a shift that would soon become impossible to ignore. The increased surveillance began quietly, woven into the existing system so seamlessly that anyone else would have missed it. But Alexander Hayes did not miss anything. He reviewed the additional reports personally, watching for inconsistencies, deviations, anything that could explain the growing sense that something about Lily Parker was operating outside the boundaries he had defined. Yet the more data he collected, the more unsettling the result became, because everything appeared perfect. Too perfect, every schedule followed precisely, every medical update within expected ranges, every interaction calm and controlled. And it was that perfection that marked the first escalation, because Alexander had built his empire on recognizing flaws, on identifying the small cracks others overlooked, and Lily presented none, which made her the only variable he could not break down into predictable parts. The first real disruption came during a routine medical review in the 6th month, when one of the specialists, a physician who had worked with Alexander's private network for over a decade, requested a private conversation, something that almost never happened without cause. And as they stood in a quiet office overlooking the city, the doctor explained that while everything appeared normal on paper, there were subtle anomalies in the data patterns, nothing dangerous, nothing that required intervention, but enough to stand out to someone experienced. The timing of certain developments was slightly ahead of expectation, the consistency unusually precise, as if the process was aligning itself with an internal rhythm rather than natural variation. And although the doctor emphasized there was no immediate concern, Alexander did not hear reassurance. He heard deviation, and deviation meant loss of control, which triggered the first true shift in his behavior. Because for the first time, he began to question not just Lily, but the entire foundation of the arrangement itself. The second escalation came only days later, and it was far more personal because it did not come from data or reports. It came directly from Lily, unprompted and impossible to categorize. When Alexander visited again, this time without warning, entering the apartment with a sharper awareness than before, determined to observe rather than assume. And as he stepped inside, Lily was already standing by the window, as she often was, but this time she spoke before he could say anything, calmly, stating that he did not need to increase the monitoring. That would not change the outcome. And for a brief moment, the room seemed to freeze because there was no logical explanation for how she could have known. That directive had been given privately, communicated only within a restricted circle, and yet she said it as if it were obvious, as if it had already been decided long ago. And when Alexander asked her directly how she knew, her answer was the same calm certainty that had begun to define her. She said that some things do not need to be told when they follow a pattern that repeats itself, and that this was simply another step in something already set in motion. And that was the moment everything shifted from controlled uncertainty into something far more dangerous, because Alexander Hayes was no longer just observing an unpredictable variable. He was facing the possibility that Lily Parker was not reacting to his decisions, but anticipating them. And if that was true, then the control he believed he had from the very beginning might never have existed at all. From that moment forward, the dynamic between Alexander Hayes and Lily Parker could no longer be explained by logic alone, because what had once felt like a controlled arrangement was now shifting into something far more complex, something that did not follow the rules Alexander had spent his entire life mastering. And for the first time in years, he began to feel a pressure he could not negotiate away, not from competitors, not from the market, but from a situation he himself had created and yet no longer fully understood. And instead of pulling back, he leaned in further, increasing his presence, attending more appointments, asking more direct questions, not out of curiosity, but out of a need to reestablish control over something that was slipping just beyond his grasp, and discretion to access, searching for anything that could explain her behavior, her awareness, her presence in his life. And when the initial findings came back, they only added to the growing unease, because while her history confirmed periods of hardship and instability, there were gaps, unexplained stretches of time where records were incomplete or missing. And those gaps, small as they were, stood out more than anything else, because in Alexander's world, missing information was never accidental. It was intentional, and intentional meant someone had shaped the narrative before him. Each step confirmed something she had long accepted, and although no one voiced it directly, the room often carried a subtle tension, a sense that they were participating in something they did not fully understand. Then, exactly as Lily had stated weeks earlier, the first signs of labor began ahead of the projected schedule. Not dramatically, not urgently, but with a calm inevitability that felt less like an event and more like the arrival of something expected. And within hours, she was admitted into a private hospital suite arranged entirely under Alexander's directive. A controlled environment designed to eliminate risk. Yet for the first time, control felt irrelevant because the timing alone had already proven that not everything was responding to his system. Alexander arrived shortly after, his presence steady, but his thoughts anything but. And as he stood just outside the room, watching the quiet coordination of medical staff, he realized that every preparation he had made, every precaution he had enforced, had been built on the assumption that outcomes could be managed. But standing there now, he felt the limits of that belief more clearly than ever before, because what was about to happen no longer felt like a result of his decisions. It felt like the continuation of something already set in motion long before he recognized it. Inside the room, Lily remained calm, her breathing measured, her focus unwavering. And when Alexander finally stepped closer, she turned to him briefly, meeting his eyes with that same steady awareness that had followed him since the beginning. And in a voice that carried neither fear nor doubt, she told him that this was where everything would become clear, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact. And in that moment, Alexander understood something he had resisted. Until now. That this had never been just about securing an heir or controlling a future. It had been leading him toward a moment of truth he could not prepare for. And as the process continued, as time moved forward with quiet precision, the tension in the room built not from chaos, but from certainty, because somewhere beneath the controlled environment, beneath the measured voices and steady procedures, there was a single undeniable realization forming. The outcome of this moment would not just change Alexander Hayes' future, it would redefine everything he believed about control, choice, and the illusion that he had ever been the one in charge. The moment finally arrived, not with chaos, but with a quiet intensity that seemed to hold everyone in place, as if time itself had narrowed into a single point that could no longer be delayed. And as the final steps of the delivery unfolded under steady hands and calm instructions, Alexander Hayes stood just close enough to witness what he had spent months preparing for, yet not close enough to feel in control of it, because that sense had already begun to fade long before this moment. And when the sound of a newborn's first breath filled the room, something shifted instantly, not just in the atmosphere, but within Alexander himself, a reaction he could not suppress or analyze, because for the first time, this was not a projection of the future. It was real, immediate, undeniable. A nurse gently carried the baby forward, offering that first glimpse that was meant to confirm everything had gone according to plan, and for a brief second, Alexander allowed himself to expect exactly that, a predictable result, a continuation of the structure he had designed. But the moment his eyes met the child, that expectation collapsed completely because what he saw did not align with anything he had prepared for. Not logically, not emotionally, not even remotely, and the shock that followed was not loud or dramatic. It was silent, absolute, the kind of realization that removes every assumption at once, leaving nothing but the truth in its place. The child's features were unmistakable in a way that could not be explained by coincidence or error, and in that instant, a memory surfaced with a clarity that felt almost unreal. A face from his past, someone he had buried beneath years of success and calculated distance, someone connected to a chapter of his life he had never allowed himself to revisit, and yet here it was, reflected back at him in a way that could not be denied. And as the weight of that recognition settled in, Alexander did not move, did not speak, because every answer he had believed in no longer applied, replaced by a single, overwhelming question he could not ignore. Slowly, he turned his attention to Lily Parker, expecting confusion, expecting at least some reaction that mirrored the impossibility of what had just happened. But instead, he found her exactly as she had always been, calm, composed, watching him with that same quiet understanding that now carried a new depth, and without raising her voice, without changing her tone, she spoke in a way that felt less like an explanation and more like the completion of something already known. She told him that some truths do not appear suddenly. They return when they are ready to be seen. And that this moment was never about surprise. It was about recognition. And those words, simple as they were, landed with a weight far greater than any revelation could have, because they confirmed what Alexander had resisted from the beginning, that this outcome was not an accident. Not a failure of control, but something far more deliberate, something connected to choices he had made long before Lily Parker ever entered his life. In that room, surrounded by controlled systems and carefully planned outcomes, Alexander Hayes faced a reality he could not restructure, because the child in front of him was not just the result of a transaction. It was a reflection of a past he had never truly escaped. And as that realization settled into something permanent, one truth became impossible to deny. This was not the end of his plan. It was the moment that revealed he had never been the one writing it. For a long moment, no one in the room spoke because the truth that had just surfaced did not need to be explained to be understood. It existed in the space between what Alexander Hayes had believed and what he was now forced to face. And as he looked at the child again, then back at Lily Parker, the structure he had built his entire life on began to shift in a way that could not be reversed, not through money, not through influence, not through control, because this was not a problem to solve. It was a reality to accept, and that distinction changed everything. Alexander had spent years convincing himself that the past could be managed the same way as the future, that decisions once made could be buried beneath success and never return. But standing there now, he understood that nothing truly disappears, it only waits, and the child in front of him was not just a new beginning. It was a continuation of something he had never finished, something tied to a person he had once chosen to walk away from when ambition demanded it. A choice he had justified at the time as necessary, strategic, unavoidable, and yet the consequences of that decision had found their way back to him through a path he never anticipated, carried not by chance, but by intention. Lily watched him carefully, not with judgment, not with anger, but with a quiet patience that suggested she had been waiting for this exact realization. And when she finally spoke, her words were not dramatic. They were steady, grounded in a truth that no longer needed to be hidden. She explained that she had known who he was long before he noticed her, that her presence in his life was not coincidence, but choice, a decision shaped by a past he had left unresolved, and that the agreement he believed he controlled had only been possible because she allowed it to be, because she needed him to arrive at this moment on his own, without force, without confrontation, without escape. The weight of that understanding settled deeply within Alexander, not as guilt alone, but as clarity, the kind that strips away illusion and leaves only what is real. And for the first time in a very long time, he did not try to negotiate, did not try to reframe the situation into something manageable. Instead, he stood there and accepted what was in front of him, not just the child, but everything that child represented. A connection he could not deny, a responsibility he could not delegate, and a truth he could no longer avoid. In the days that followed, the systems he had relied on remained in place. The structure of his world did not collapse, but something within it changed permanently because control was no longer the center of his decisions, understanding was, and while that shift did not erase the past, it allowed him to face it differently, not as something to hide from, but as something to learn from. And as he looked at the child once more, no longer searching for answers, but recognizing what had always been. There, one realization remained clear above all else, that the most important things in life are never transactions. They're consequences, and whether accepted or ignored, they always find their way back, not to punish, but to remind, and this time, Alexander. Hayes did not look away.